There is a particular kind of quiet that grows inside a woman who has been dismissed too many times. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice. It simply settles the way dust settles on the top shelf of a room nobody enters anymore, and over the years it becomes so thick, so layered, that even the woman herself begins to mistake it for peace. Marlene Thibodaux knew that quiet well. She had lived inside it for 7 years. She was 53 years old, born and raised in a small town outside of Lafayette, Louisiana, where the heat came early in the spring and the Spanish moss hung low over the bayou like something the land was trying to hide. She had grown up in a house full of women who did not complain, her mother, her aunts, her grandmother, all of them soft-spoken, all of them survivors of things they never named out loud. And she had carried that inheritance forward, not because she was weak, but because somewhere along the way she had been taught that endurance was the same thing as dignity. She had married Douglas Thibodaux when she was 29. He was charming then, the kind of man who remembered the name of every waitress and tipped too well and laughed loudly at his own jokes before he'd even finished telling them. She had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that, if only to herself. She had genuinely, fully loved him, the version of him that existed in the first 3 years of their marriage, when they were still building something together and the house on Magnolia Street smelled like fresh paint and possibility. But people change, or rather they reveal themselves slowly, the way water reveals the shape of stone only after it has worn it down. Douglas had a gift for erasure. That was the only word Marlene had ever found that fit him properly. He did not yell often. He did not throw things. He was not the kind of man who left bruises you could point to. He was the kind of man who spoke over you in conversations with other people, then caught your eye afterward and smiled as if to say, "See how well I handle things." He was the kind of man who critiqued your cooking in front of his sister, then told you later that you were too sensitive. Who borrowed money from your personal savings account, the one you had kept from before the marriage, the one your father had left you, without mentioning it until the balance appeared on a bank statement, and then explained it away so smoothly, so reasonably, that by the time the conversation was over you almost believed it had been your idea. She had stayed quiet through all of it. She stayed quiet the first time he told her she was overreacting. She stayed quiet the second and third and 40th time. She stayed quiet through his business partners who spoke directly to him even when she was the one who had asked the question. She stayed quiet when her name was removed from the joint account, quietly, administratively, the way you remove an outdated item from a menu, no announcement, just a sudden absence. And for a long time, she convinced herself that this was simply marriage, that this was the weight every woman carried, that her mother had carried it and her grandmother before her, and that the carrying was not cruelty but simply the shape of things. Then her daughter left for college. Cassie was 22 now, living in New Orleans, working at a nonprofit that helped women navigate housing instability after domestic situations. And one Sunday afternoon in October, Cassie called home while Douglas was out at the hardware store, and something in her voice that afternoon, some careful, quiet gentleness, made Marlene stop moving entirely and just stand in the kitchen with the phone against her ear, looking at the afternoon light falling through the yellow curtains she had sewn herself 3 summers ago. "Mama," Cassie said, "are you happy?" Marlene had opened her mouth to say yes. The yes was already there, fully formed, polished from years of use, and then somehow it did not come out. What came out instead was a silence so long that her daughter began to cry softly on the other end. "I thought so," Cassie said. "I've thought so for a long time." That was the first crack, not a collapse, just a hairline fracture running through the wall Marlene had spent years building around herself. She told Cassie she was fine. She told her not to worry. But that night, lying in bed beside Douglas while he scrolled his phone in the blue light, she felt something shift inside her chest, not rage, not yet, but something quieter and more dangerous than rage, a kind of clarity. She started paying attention differently after that. She noticed the way he spoke about her to his friends, not unkindly exactly, but with a casual diminishment, a running editorial. "Marlene worries too much. Marlene doesn't understand business. Marlene takes everything personally." The comments were light, throwaway, the kind of thing a man says when he wants to bond with other men by gently mocking his wife, and everyone laughs because everyone has one of those wives, and nobody stops to think about whether the wife can hear it. She could hear it. She had always been able to hear it. She had simply chosen, for 7 years, not to respond. She also noticed during those weeks of paying attention that the money was not where it was supposed to be. Douglas ran a small electrical contracting business. He had 3 employees, a decent client list, a steady income. But the household finances had always been managed by him, a fact she had accepted years ago without fully examining why. Now she began to examine it. She began to make notes. Not in an obvious way, she wasn't dramatic about it, wasn't building a case like some detective in a television program. She simply started remembering things, writing things down, looking at documents that had always sat on the corner of his desk, unopened by her, taken on faith. What she found took 3 weeks to fully understand, and another 2 weeks to believe. Douglas had opened a second business account 6 years ago, the year after her father died, the year her inheritance had arrived. The money that had gone into that account did not show up in any tax return she could locate. The documentation was complicated in the way that complicated things are when someone has made them deliberately complicated: overlapping business names, a cousin's address in Baton Rouge used as a mailing address, transfers that looked like contractor payments but had no corresponding invoices. It was not clean, what he had done. It was the financial equivalent of a room that appears tidy until you open the closet. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. She did not confront him immediately. She had learned over 7 years that confronting Douglas when she was unprepared was like showing up to a fight without shoes. He was better at it than her, quicker, more practiced at turning a fact into a question and a question into an accusation and an accusation back into her fault. She needed something she had never permitted herself to have before. She needed to be ready. She called her cousin Diane in Baton Rouge. Diane had divorced her first husband 12 years ago, a difficult divorce, a necessary one, and she knew a lawyer. Not a general family attorney, but a woman who specialized specifically in financial concealment within marriages, a woman whose whole career had been built on the premise that what is hidden can be found. The consultation lasted 2 hours. Marlene drove herself there on a Wednesday, while Douglas was at a job site, and she sat in a small, clean office with good lighting and a plant on the windowsill, and she told the truth out loud for the first time, and she could not remember how long. Not a performance of the truth, not a softened version of it, just the truth. The attorney listened without interrupting. When Marlene finished, the woman set down her pen and said, "You've been documenting this yourself." "I started 3 weeks ago," Marlene said. "Good," the woman said. "Keep going." What followed was a careful, deliberate 3-month process that Marlene would later describe to Cassie as the most concentrated period of her adult life. She gathered records. The attorney requested disclosure through proper legal channels. A forensic accountant was brought in, a small, precise man who spoke the language of financial irregularity, the way a doctor speaks the language of symptoms, calmly, specifically, with no drama. What he found confirmed what Marlene had suspected, and then exceeded it. Douglas had not just moved money. Over the course of 6 years, he had moved a significant portion of shared marital assets into accounts that Marlene had no legal access to and no awareness of. Some of it had gone to fund a property investment, a small rental property in Breaux Bridge that Marlene had never been told existed. Some of it had gone to fund expenses that were personal in nature and not disclosed. The total figure, when the accountant laid it out in a 2-page document with clean columns, was enough to make Marlene sit very still for a long time. She did not cry in that meeting. She had done her crying at home, in private, in increments, a little at a time over those months, the way you drain something slowly so it doesn't flood. By the time she sat in that office with the numbers in front of her, she was past crying. She was somewhere else, somewhere quieter and more certain. She was in the place she had been building her way toward for 3 months. She was ready. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening in February. Douglas had come home from work in a good mood, a big contract signed, he said, pouring himself a glass of bourbon in the kitchen. Marlene had made dinner. She had set the table properly, the way she always did, the small white plates she had inherited from her mother, the blue placemats, the candles she had lit because it was Thursday, and she had always lit candles on Thursday, even when nothing else was right. She waited until he sat down. And then she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She had thought about this moment many times in the preceding weeks, imagined it in many versions in which she wept, versions in which she was cold, versions in which the whole thing unraveled into shouting. But the version that actually happened was none of those. The version that actually happened was very quiet and very specific and very complete. She told him what she knew. She used the numbers. She used the dates. She said the name of the account, the name of the property, the name of the attorney, the name of the forensic accountant. Douglas began to speak after the first sentence. She kept going. He shifted tactic after the second. She kept going. By the time she finished, his bourbon sat untouched. He had not moved from his chair, but something in his posture had changed, the particular kind of collapse that happens when the architecture of a performance loses its audience, when there is no longer any use in pretending, when the other person knows exactly as much as you know and there is nowhere left to redirect them. He said several things after that. Some of them were explanations, some were accusations, some were a form of the word sorry that carried no weight because it arrived wrapped in justification. She did not respond to any of it with the urgency it seemed to demand. She had already said everything she had come to say. She told him she had contacted an attorney. She told him the process had already begun. She rose from the table, took her plate to the kitchen, washed it carefully, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet where it belonged. The divorce took 11 months. It was not peaceful, but it was not chaotic either, because Marlene had arrived at it prepared in a way that Douglas had never anticipated she was capable of, and this preparation, this quiet, steady, thoroughly documented preparation, gave her a position that was difficult to argue against. The financial concealment was addressed through the legal proceedings. The rental property was included in the asset division. Her father's inheritance, significantly depleted, was partially recovered. She did not get everything back. That was not the story. Some losses are not recoverable, and Marlene was honest with herself about that. 7 years is a long time. Some of those years she would not get back. Some of the confidence she had lost in herself during that time would take longer to rebuild than she cared to admit. But she moved into a small house on the other side of Lafayette in the early autumn of that year, a house with a narrow front porch and a magnolia tree in the yard, and windows that faced east so that the morning light came through early and filled the kitchen with something warm and uncomplicated. Cassie helped her move in. They spent 2 days setting up the rooms, arguing gently about where furniture should go, ordering takeout on the second night and eating it on the porch in the early dark, listening to the bayou frogs start up their evening noise. "Are you okay, Mama?" Cassie asked. Marlene considered the question the same way she had considered it the first time her daughter had asked it, carefully, honestly, without reaching for the easy answer. "I think I am," she said. "I think I'm going to be." And there was something in the way she said it, something unhurried, something grounded, that made it sound less like reassurance and more like something she actually believed. She started sleeping well again. Not immediately. There were still nights when the old weight settled on her chest and she lay in the dark cataloging the years, counting the moments she should have spoken and didn't. But those nights grew fewer. The mornings grew lighter. She began cooking for herself the way she had always wanted to cook, without commentary, without critique, filling the kitchen on Saturday afternoons with the smell of things she had gone years without making because Douglas hadn't cared for them. She planted tomatoes in the side yard in the spring. She started attending a Sunday afternoon book club at the public library, a small group of women, most of them around her age, most of them with stories of their own, none of which were discussed directly, but all of which were understood. There was a comfort in that room that had nothing to do with literature and everything to do with recognition. She did not miss Douglas. This surprised her at first. She had expected to miss him, or at least to miss the idea of him, the version of a life she had thought she was building. But what she felt instead was a profound and steady relief, the kind of relief that settles into a body that has been braced against something for a very long time and is finally allowed to soften. She thought sometimes about those 7 years of silence, not why. Bitterness, she was trying hard to move away from bitterness, not because it was undeserved, but because she had seen what bitterness did to women who held it too long, how it occupied the same space that peace should have occupied, and she had already given Douglas Thibodaux enough of her interior real estate. She thought about the silence the way you think about a season you've passed through, something that was real, something that changed you, something you survived. She had survived it. More than that, she had turned to face it. She had spoken, finally, clearly, specifically, without apology, in the language of documentation and dates and dollar amounts, and she had been heard, not because he had listened, but because the truth does not require the person who hid it to validate it. There is a particular kind of strength that grows inside a woman who has been dismissed too many times and finally decides she has been dismissed enough. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't perform or posture. It simply becomes available, the way certain light becomes available only after a long cloud cover breaks, quiet and thorough and warming everything it touches. Marlene found that light on the east-facing porch of her small house in the early morning, with the magnolia tree going white with blooms and the coffee cooling in her hands and the day just beginning to open. She found it. She was not the woman she had been at 29, full of a love that turned out to be partly a projection. She was not the woman she had been at 46, erased incrementally by someone who had mistaken her patience for permission. She was 53 years old, she was awake, she was home. And for the first time in a very long time, the quiet around her was not the quiet of something suppressed. It was the quiet of a woman who had said everything she needed to say and was now, at last, at rest.